Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I look at the Armie Hammer cannibalism scandal? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So here I'll look at the background of Armie Hammer. I'll talk about the scandal, and then I'll look at the paraphilia that is associated with cannibalism. I'll talk about what the research literature has to say on that topic. Starting with the background, Armand Douglas Hammer was born in Santa Monica, California on August 28, 1986. His father owned businesses, including a television production company, and his mother worked in a bank. His great-grandfather was Armand Hammer. He ran Occidental Petroleum from 1957 until his death in 1990. He was a famous business person. His net worth was about $200 million. Armie Hammer dropped out of high school in 11th grade to pursue working as an actor. He had guest appearances on a number of television shows, including Veronica Mars, Arrested Development, and Desperate Housewives. His first movie role was in 2006, but the role that would make him popular was in the 2010 movie, The Social Network. That same year, he married a businesswoman and television personality named Elizabeth Chambers. They would have 2 children together. Hammer would go on to have many roles in various television shows and movies. In 2011, he was arrested in Texas for possessing marijuana. The charges were dropped. In 2013, he did an interview with Playboy, during which he said that he was a dominant lover who liked grabbing women by their neck and hair. Later, he would indicate that he was intoxicated during the interview. In 2020, Hammer and Chambers announced that they were separating. This brings us to January 2021. Hammer found himself in the middle of a scandal when screenshots of what appear to be direct messages were released. Allegedly, the messages were written by Armie Hammer. In these messages, we see a description of graphic fantasies of a sexual nature, including references to cannibalism. Hammer announced on January 13, 2021, that he was stepping down from his role in the movie Shotgun Wedding. This movie co-stars Jennifer Lopez. He suggested the claims against him were vicious and spurious attacks, and he couldn't in good conscience leave his children for the 4 months required to shoot the film. A former romantic partner, Courtney Vuskovic, who dated Hammer for a couple months starting in June of 2020, described him as a chameleon and said that he wanted to take a bite out of her. Specifically, he wanted to break off her rib, barbecue it, and eat it. She implied that Hammer was manipulative and had a presence that captivated young women. Hammer would groom women in relationships and make them believe that he never felt about anybody the way he felt about them. She described him as consuming across several dimensions, including mentally, emotionally, financially, and physically. Usually, when somebody describes a romantic partner as physically consuming, it's a figure of speech. She said that she had post-traumatic stress disorder and is receiving therapy. Let's look at some of the content in these direct messages that were allegedly sent by Hammer. The writer of these messages, whoever it is, indicated that he is 100% cannibal. In another message, he references the master-slave relationship, so we see this connection to dominant and submissive sex. In one discussion, he talks about owning a woman and wants to know if the woman would become his property until they die. He also asked a woman if she would cut off one of her toes so he could keep it in his pocket. He always wanted to have a piece of her in his possession. Sounds like he may have just read the little-known book, Hannibal Lecter's Guide to Short-Term Romance. So what could be going on in a situation like this? There are a few important notes here. As I mentioned, the direct messages have not been verified. If one were to run under the assumption that Hammer wrote them, that doesn't mean that he has some type of paraphilia. He could have been joking, he could have been acting, substance use could be involved. There are many explanations outside of paraphilia. So now moving away from Armie Hammer and talking about the cannibalism fetish that appears to be referenced in those messages. There is a distinction drawn between unusual, persistent, and intense sexual interests, known as paraphilias, and paraphilic disorders. A paraphilic disorder is usually diagnosed when a paraphilia leads to dysfunction. Somebody can have a paraphilia and not have the corresponding paraphilic disorder. However, with most paraphilias, acting on them is illegal. Therefore, if somebody has that paraphilia and they act on it, they would likely be eligible for the corresponding paraphilic disorder. The overwhelming majority of people diagnosed with these disorders are men, and the course of these disorders is almost always chronic. So they are serious conditions that require treatment. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, there are several paraphilias that have their own disorders. For example, Vorarephilia and exhibitionism. However, a sexual fantasy or desire around cannibalism is not a separate diagnostic category, but it does have a name. It's called Vorarephilia. It comes from the Latin word meaning to devour. If somebody has this to such an extent that it qualified as a mental disorder, it would be classified as other specified paraphilic disorder, and then in parentheses the word Vorarephilia. Vorarephilia is when individuals are sexually aroused by one or more of the following three situations: the idea of being eaten, eating another person, or watching one of those activities. The vast majority of individuals who have this disorder do not actually try to turn it into a physical reality. Rather, it is a fantasy, like many different paraphilias. There have been notable exceptions, however, including Albert Fish, Ed Gein, and Jeffrey Dahmer. The most famous in recent times, however, is a man named Armin Maywest, otherwise known as the Rotenburg Cannibal. So just some clarity on the name, because I know this probably could be a bit confusing. With Armin Maywest, his first name is spelled A-R-M-I-N. It has nothing to do with Armand, like Armand Hammer. That's just a coincidence. Armin Maywest was born in 1961 in West Germany. He had worked as a computer repair technician. In 2001, he killed and ate a victim who had volunteered. Maywest started with the victim's member. One could say that Lorena Bobbitt was his hero. Because of the voluntary nature of this crime, Maywest was convicted of manslaughter instead of murder and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison in 2004. However, people were not happy with that outcome, so in 2006, he was retried for murder, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. The prosecutor implied that because Maywest had a sexual motive, the original charge should have been murder. It has been reported that Maywest is now a vegetarian. They have to provide him a special diet in prison. I wonder if he has a particular preference for carrots. What do we know from the research literature about Vorarephilia? For example, what would we expect in terms of comorbidity? Like if somebody had that condition, what other conditions might they also have? What conditions are associated with it? Vorarephilia is a relatively rare paraphilia. The vast majority of the time it is studied, it is in relation to fantasy, not people who actually carried it out, like Maywest. It does have an association with a number of other paraphilias, including macrophilia and microphilia. This is when somebody is sexually attracted to unrealistically large or small people, not people that could be found in the population. So, for example, if a man wants to be eaten by a giant woman, that's something that would remain a fantasy because there are no giant women. So we see with the cannibalism, that one's technically possible, but with macrophilia and microphilia, they are not technically possible to turn into a physical reality. Vorarephilia is also associated with humanoid animal paraphilias, like people who dress up in animal costumes and have sex. In addition to these two associations, we see that this particular condition is associated with being dominant or submissive. If somebody had Vorarephilia and they wanted to make their desires a reality, this profile could be consistent with antisocial tendencies, because trying to make this paraphilia into a reality, of course, is criminal, irresponsible, and shows a disregard for safety. One could theorize that individuals with this condition want to express ultimate dominance. Simply being physically dominant in sex isn't enough for them. They want to consume the person, completely dominate them. As I mentioned, this activity is illegal. On top of that, there are some other logistical problems. For example, a person like this would need a new supply of romantic partners. They would be kind of restricted to short-term relationships. Are there any clues that someone is dating a person with Vorarephilia? Any red flags to look out for? There are certain behaviors, I think, that could indicate this condition. So if we're talking about a romantic situation and we're looking at the person who is suspected of having the condition, if their partner says something like, "This is really eating me up," and they get jealous about whatever that stressor is, that's a clue. If the person suspected of having the condition says, "I'm so hungry I could eat anyone," anything. Anything is what I said. That could be a clue. Other clues could include if they think the Joy of Cooking recipe book is a love story, if when they're watching something like The Walking Dead, they always root for the zombies, and if they take it as foreplay when their partner uses the phrase, "Stick a fork in me, I'm done." Those are my thoughts on the Armie hammer scandal and Vorarephilia. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.